I thank the member for Moreton. The question is the bill be read a second time, and I call the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As a member for Goldstein, it is a great privilege to be able to speak on this legislation. And I speak on this legislation, of course, with the Coalition as somebody who supports it, because there is no legislation in this parliament, Deputy Speaker, that has been ever put forward by the former member, the current member for Isaacs that has not needed improvement. The member for Isaacs, who of course established the Administrative Review Tribunal in the last parliament, has a history and litany of train wreck legislation that needs constant improvement, like his tenure as a minister in government. And I say this with sadness, Deputy Speaker, but when he isn't turning up to Teal fundraisers and events in Goldstein or sending volunteers to Goldstein to help Teal candidates get elected, even though they claim to be independent, he puts forward legislation that is a train wreck before this parliament. And of course, this legislation is designed to fix the legacy of the member for Isaacs, who every time he has tried to put things forward has gone on to fail and create more problems and more confusion than the problems were there that he sought to solve in the first place. I remember this well and truly back in my time as Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, Deputy Speaker, when we were dealing with the legacy of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd governments and the children who were locked in detention as a result of those governments who were asylum seekers. And during that time, Deputy Speaker, the member for Isaacs, the latter stage, was Attorney-General. And during that period as Attorney-General, he had a number of choices that he could confront. Some of those choices could have been to get children out of detention, just like these sorts of legislation, review the Administrative Review Tribunal, reviewing legislation to assess whether people should have pathways to be able to get out of visa or migration pathways. But that wasn't the pathway that the member for Isaacs took. As Attorney-General, his solution was to seek to abolish the Office of Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, which was the office that was in part responsible for oversight of the treatment of those children in detention. So what do we have? We had children denied education. The solution to that was abolish the person who had oversight for it. It was that they were suffering mental health conditions. The member for Isaac's solution was abolish the person whose responsibility was to have oversight for mental health deterioration of children in the custodianship of the government. At every single point, what we had was a government, the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, that were involved in demonisation and humiliation of children and a rapid advancement in their mental health deterioration, and his only answer to those situations was through different pieces of legislation put forward to abolish the Office of Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, which included a pathway to remove any oversight or to actually address the problems of how the government was bullying, demonising or delegitimising children. So I am not surprised that this legislation had to be put forward by this government to fix the long litany of, once again, the member for Isaacs' problems. This legislation, he was very vocal today in question time when anyone dared question the correlation and relationship between the Australian Labor Party and, of course, the CFMEU, and was outraged that anybody highlight the deep connection where Labor parties received $7 million worth of funding, or the fact that the head of the Victorian branch, who is directly connected to figures like Mick Gatto and John Setka, sits on the national executive of the Australian Labor Party, including by, I think it's the member for Bruce, who's sitting opposite at the table right now, sits also with the head of the Victorian division of the CFMEU on the national executive. But apparently there's no issue here. Nobody can see any issues or problems, because, even though they're directly associating with criminal and organised gangs. But again, no one from the Labor Party seems to care. So yes, the previous speaker who spoke before is right. There are issues around making sure there's transparency and oversight and process that's being followed. But I can well and truly be confident that you're not going to get it from this Labor government. That's why their legislation that the member for Isaacs introduced in the previous parliament needs to be fixed, because despite his promise of a grand future of the Administrative Review Tribunal ushering in a new era of review rights to make sure that there was integrity and trust and transparency sitting behind tribunal hearing processes, Instead, it has turned into a catastrophe on epic proportions. The AAT, which was doing its job, which was making sure there was proper review processes of administrative decisions, was replaced by a body stacked with his mates, which is now slower, more expensive and facing the largest backlog in its history. The caseload's now increased to 67,000 matters, substantially more than it was the case when we were last in office. Median case times have now blown out to 30 weeks to 68 weeks under the member for Isaacs and, of course, the current Attorney-General. Student visa appeals have risen from around 2,000 cases to more than 40,000. An extraordinary growth, Deputy Speaker, by any measure of which to count. Labor's abolition of the AAT was a vindictive, malicious and unnecessary attack designed solely for the purpose they didn't get to appoint every single person who sat on it, and they wanted to be able to make sure that it was like the Fair Work Commission or another organisation where only their people sat on it because they want to control every single part of the artifice and control the state. Well, sorry, Deputy Speaker, but we live in a democracy. There are, of course, a diversity of views that are allowed to be had. There are a diversity of views that are allowed to be spoken, and sure as night follows day, some people are entitled to be able to be part of the artifice of the state that are not members of the Australian Labor Party. Shocking as I know, Member for Cook, shocking as I know. Shocking as I know, some people are allowed to serve the Australian community even if they are not signed-up members of the Labor Party. This is not Pyongyang yet. When the Prime Minister comes back from one of his international sojourns, as he does, and tries to treat this parliament like the National People's Congress, some of us are still going to be here quite happily asking him questions which are not the questions that he wants to have asked of him, not the ones of telling him how wonderful he is or how glorious his new regime is or all of his incredible success stories that he wants to boast and claim about. Some of us are going to ask him difficult questions about the correlation and relationships that he has, including why it is that he relies on the votes of the head of the Victorian division of the CFMEU, on the National Executive of the Labor Party.
Order. Can I just remind the member to be relevant to the legislation?
Absolutely, Deputy Speaker. I'm being 100% relevant to the legislation because we're talking about review rights, review processes, and I think it's very important to make sure that we're drawing very clearly the issue of transparency, consistency and review rights, and, of course, the integrity that goes right to the heart of this government. And, in fact, that was a key theme of the former members, and, in fact, just about every single member who's got up and spoken on this legislation. Integrity of the right of the legislation and how it speaks to this government. And I agree with them. I agree with them. And when we've got the member for Bruce, who's sitting now at the table, standing only moments ago, and he's directly connected to the head of the Victorian division of the CFMEU.
Order. The Minister.
Yeah, on relevance and respect for the chair, word association is not relevance. That is an unhinged rant that has nothing to do with the clause in the bill, and you didn't move a second reading amendment.
As I've already mentioned, the member should be relevant to the legislation.
As outlined, Deputy Speaker, the Administrative Review Tribunal and other legislation amendment Bill 2025 goes directly to the process and integrity of the government. All of the other speakers from the government have made this point. They have used as a basis to extol the virtues of the government. All I am simply highlighting and shining a bright light. I realise it's very difficult for the member sitting opposite to have it highlighted upon them because it shows an uncomfortable truth, that if you're going to make your integrity central to the passage of a piece of legislation, and it's going to be embodied in the legislation because you are saying this bill, as the minister themselves said, was the foundations of this legislation, that review, process, transparency in decision-making, then maybe association with the head of criminal enterprises is not a great place to start. I happen to agree. Just like the conduct of the current member for Isaacs, I know he'll be former one day, but for the moment he's current, and his consistent failure around processes of legislation which have led to the need to introduce this bill is also an important part of the conversation. So, of course, we do have a problem with the law as it currently operates. Labor's bill has failed the Australian community. It has delayed decision-making. Australians have been let down, and part of it's because we have a minister who's sitting at the table, we have ministers who sit on those benches, the government benches over there, and they simply are not interested in driving legislation which is going to improve the Australian community. They simply have legislation which advances the interests of the people that they seek to represent, which is primarily the patronage and power associated with the Labor Party. And, of course, even when they appoint people to the Administrative Review Tribunal to do exactly that, they're being failed by them. But it's the Australian community that are suffering the consequences of the patronage network of the Labor Party. So, this legislation is designed as a backflip, acknowledging the simple reality their legislation has failed. It isn't going to work for the Australian community, so they are having to fix up their administrative mess. Of course, as much as we don't want a backflip because we'd rather the law worked, we welcome a decision of a backflip from the Labor Party because it means we might actually see some improvement in decision-making and actually see an improvement in the pathway for decision-making. Simply to be able to allow the Tribunal to make decisions on the papers for significant migration matters, starting with student visa refusals, and gives it a broader discretion to decide other matters on written material. It allows applicants will still be invited to provide written submissions and respond to any adverse information before a decision is made. And these reforms are designed to improve efficiency and reduce the record backlog and deliver faster, fairer outcomes. So, yes, we are fixing the problems of the legislation put forward by the Labor Party that has led to a huge backlog for those many Australians who rely simply, or those who are not even Australians, who rely on the Administrative Review Tribunal as the basis for fair decision-making. I just wish the Labor Party would acknowledge that there is a need for transparent, informed, integrity-based decision-making in so many other areas. Just like we don't have that in the context of Australian construction industry right now, where we know that because of the failure of the Labor government, we have the flagrant abuse of the law, we have ongoing allegations and whistleblower evidence coming out increasingly highlighting the minister has failed and their solution has failed to corruption on Australian work sites, and we have an administration which has become an enabler of corruption. Now, if you've got that in one area and you've got a failure, as you have with the Administrative Review Tribunal, and to their credit, the government eventually acknowledges, yes, the member for Isaacs didn't get it right and we have to fix up his mess once again, then maybe they could turn around and say, the current Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations is failing the Australian community, is an enabler of corruption, and maybe she needs to fix that legislation as well.
Order. I'd ask that you withdraw that, please.
I'll withdraw. The minister has failed the Australian community, and whistleblowers are saying that corruption is running rife under the solution that is currently legislated. She is oversighting and she is backing to the hilt and is saying the strongest possible course of action. And when it comes down to it, when you acknowledge a failure like the Administrative Review Tribunal, when you acknowledge an issue like the failure of the Administrative Review Tribunal and you're prepared to amend the legislation to acknowledge the failure of the Administrative Review Tribunal, maybe it's time to look at other institutions and artifices that you have introduced and try and fix those as well. So now this is a teaching moment, not just of the failure of the member for Isaacs, but of course of the legacy of Senator Murray Watt and of course the current operations of the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. But we know full well there will be no action by this government. There won't be action by this government for a simple reason, because too many people on the other side of this chamber right now are tainted and directly connected to the misconduct that is leading to a situation that they want to perpetuate. There is a real need now for this parliament to stand up and call out the conduct that is leading to corruption on Australian work sites. And we are going to continue to prosecute this argument every step of the way, and I hope that when the Prime Minister and others call this conduct out and improve the standing for the Australian community.
I thank the member for Goldstein. Goldstein, it depends where you come from, I think, how you pronounce it.